Hey guys, so this is part 2 of my little series on Python requests. And in the first part, I covered basically GET requests. So GET requests are the same kind of requests that you make when you are asking the browser for a particular page. So if you navigate to a site in your URL bar here, then the browser is performing a GET request for you. But in addition to GET requests, we have POST requests, PUT requests, and PATCH requests. I'm only going to cover POST requests in this video, but the three that I just mentioned, so POST, PATCH, and PUT, they are similar in the sense that you use them to change something on the server that you're sending the request to. So later in this video, I'm going to have an example with Stripe. So in the case of Stripe, you're changing something on Stripe server. So you're basically telling Stripe server to perform a payment for you and charge someone's card. So before I get to that, I want to show you basically how you can send data through POST requests and a little bit about what it looks like when the server actually receives it. So since I don't have like a good test server, I'm going to use something called request bin. And I have this set up on Heroku because the original request bin doesn't exist anymore. So if you want to use it, you have to use it through your own server. So I just set it up on Heroku. So what I'll do is I'll start by creating a request bin. And then it gives me a URL, and it also gives me examples. And before we get into actually running it, just take a look at how little Python code you need to perform the example, whereas with others, it takes a lot more. If you use .NET or Java, it takes quite a bit of code just to do something very simple. PHP is simple, but .NET, Java, a lot of code. Node, a little bit more. But Python requests, it's only 4 lines of code. So as you can see, the library is good for abstracting a lot of things away. So I'm going to copy this example and put it into my script and fix the print statements here because they are wrong. Okay, so before I run this, just to give you an overview of what request bin does, is basically you send a POST request to it or a PUT request or whatever you want, and it basically tells you everything that was sent with the requests. So once I run this script, and make sure you have requests running if you want to run this along with me. So Python and then script.py. I'm going to run this. It should return the status code and the content. So I see 200 and I see OK. And then if I refresh the page, this is the request that I just performed. So it tells me some information, like it tells me the IP address where the request came from. It has the URL, which is the same URL that is in the code. And then it has the headers that are sent along with the request. So these are all the standard headers. I didn't add any headers directly. And then it has the data for the request. So we see TS and then it has a number here. So what's being sent here in the data, if we look, is the time. So the key is called TS and the time comes from time.time, which is imported from the Python standard library. And we see the time that I send the request. So if I do this again, the time should change. Okay, so if I just refresh this, I'll see the second request. Here we have TS, and then the time should be slightly different. So this is just, I believe, the time in seconds since like 1970, something like that. But basically it changes every time you send the request. So what I'll do is I will send some other data. So in addition to the time, I'll send something like hello, and then I'll put my name. And then I'll send this request and refresh. And we see the data is here. So we see a key called hello and a value called Anthony. And notice that you see it twice because one is the raw version of it and then this other one is like the pretty version of it. So instead of sending data here, which I have using the data parameter, I can also send JSON data. So run the script again. And now it looks a little bit different. So let's compare these two. So with this POST request, it has none for form/post parameters, whereas for this one, it has something. But if you notice here for the one where we use JSON, it has the data, but it just looks a little different. So the main difference between data and JSON is basically how the server interprets the data. So with data, it's being interpreted as a form that's being sent to the server. So an HTML form, you can type it in and hit enter. What happens is that data is sent as form data, and the server reads it as form data. Whereas with JSON, the data is sent through the raw body of the request, and then the content type header is different. So if you look here, content type application/JSON, that means that the server should parse this raw body as JSON data. It takes this data and parses it as JSON. Whereas in this case, it doesn't have to parse it in some sense because it's already as form data. Now this depends on the type of server and like the web server or app server that they're using. But generally speaking, these two are handled slightly differently. Like for example, in Flask, you would use the request.form dictionary to get this data, this data. This is the form data, whereas you would use request.json to get this. So Flask parses it for you, but sometimes you're working with something where you have to parse it directly. So by looking at the content type, you can parse it as JSON data instead of just form data. So that's normally something that you don't have to worry about when you're making a server, and you definitely don't have to worry about it when you're sending the request. You just send whatever they're expecting. So if they want you to send form data, like we'll see in the Stripe example, then you send form data. So you use the data parameter. And if they expect you to send JSON, then you use the JSON parameter. And if they expect anything else, then it just depends on whatever the case is, and you have to construct your request to reflect whatever they want. So this is actually pretty straightforward. It's very similar to the Git case, but really the only difference is something is happening on the server. So I have this server set up, and it just mirrors what we send. So now I'm going to get into an example where we actually do something for real. Well, actually, it's going to be a test example where I'm not going to charge anybody's credit card, but you could potentially if you wanted to. So I'm going to open up this file, and all the code is going to be in the description below if you want to follow along with this. So I have this app file, and this is a very, very simple Flask app setup. So you need to install Flask if you don't have it already. So I'll install it here, and while it installs, I'll talk about what's going on here. So this is a very simple Flask app. As you can see, it's only 15 lines, but this is going to be for the Stripe example. So this doesn't do anything yet, but it displays some of the information and the page that we need. So here I'm just importing the things from Flask that I'm using. Line 3, I instantiate the Flask app object, which is needed to create the server. Here I'm just turning on debug mode so we can see the errors in the console when they happen, and so the code will refresh automatically, or the server will restart automatically when the code changes. And then I have two routes here. So starting on line 6, this route simply returns a HTML template, which I'll show you in a moment. And the second one is going to handle the charge. So this is where we're going to build the Stripe stuff. So to do Stripe stuff. And what I have so far are two things. I have an API key. So this is the API key from Stripe. And then I have a token. So this token comes from the form that gets submitted to this endpoint. And if we take a look at the index file that I have, it's very simple. So actually it's not so simple, but in terms of what I did to this, it's simple. So if we take a look at the Stripe documentation, they basically give you an example where you can submit a payment using this. They give you HTML, they give you CSS, and they give you JavaScript. So all I did was I took all three, I combined them into one file instead of having three. So we see like JavaScript here, we see HTML here, and we see some CSS here. So it's combined into one HTML file. And in addition to that, I imported Bulma just to make it look a little bit better. It's still pretty ugly, which you'll see in a moment, but it's just an example. So I want to focus more on the request part, not so much the HTML part. So this, like I said, is just Bulma wrapping the HTML that they have here. So very simple stuff. And there's a request sent to charge through the HTML form. So here /charge. So the data in this form will get sent to this charge route here. So just a very quick overview of how the Stripe API works when you're using the card elements is when someone fills out the form, they type in their credit card number and they hit submit. So what happens actually is that form first submits to Stripe servers. So the credit card information is being sent to Stripe. The credit card information isn't actually being sent to your server, or at least it shouldn't be. So the credit card information is sent to Stripe. Stripe takes that credit card information and it creates a token for you, and it returns that token to your page. So that's what all the JavaScript down here is doing. So it takes that token and then it puts it into the form and it submits it to your server. So now when it's on your server, you take that token and you use that token to charge the card. So you never actually see the person's credit card information, which makes it secure, but you can charge that credit card because you have a token that represents that credit card. So if you look at the code here, in addition to the API key, I have the token. So this token represents the credit card that the user types in to make a payment. And then what you do here is you specify the specifics of the payment. So, you know, how much they're paying, the currency, and the description, as we'll see in a moment. So that's all I'm doing here. So the next part is creating charges. And with Stripe, they actually have a Python SDK, which makes this really simple, but I won't be using that because I'm using requests and I want to demonstrate that. So if we go to the curl example, this is pretty much the closest thing that we can get to a raw request. So this URL here is the URL that's going to go into the URL for the request. You should already know about that. And then we have the API key, and this needs to be handled in a certain way, which I'll show you. Then we have the amount, the currency, the description, and the source is the token. So whatever the token is, I'm just going to pass it to the source. So the API key is the hardest thing. So let's start with that. So what happens is the form gets submitted and the token gets passed to this route here. And I get it here as this variable called token. So what I want to do is I want to use this token to authorize myself. And there's a certain way that you use tokens to authorize yourself to different APIs. It depends on which API that you're using, but a very common approach is to use a header. And inside of the header, you have a key called authorization. And then the value of that key is the word bearer followed by the actual API key. So let's go ahead and do that now. So here, if I create a headers dictionary, I want to pass in one key. So authorization. So it's in caps. You know what? I'll do this. I'll use the actual curly brackets to make this a little more clear. So the key for this is going to be the word authorization, capital A. And then the value is going to be a string with bearer, so B-E-A-R-E-R, followed by the actual token. So token goes here. So I have the API key or token. They're used interchangeably, what you call them. So it can be called an API key, it can be called an API token. It just depends. So I'll just say key goes here. So I'll make this an F string so I can pass in the key directly. And the name of the key is API key. So now this is the headers dictionary that I'm going to send along with the request. So let me start by constructing that request. So r equals request.post, and then I'm going to pass in the URL. So the URL is here. And then I'll pass in the headers. So headers equals headers. So this is just like what I talked about in the previous video. Now what I need to do is I need to handle the data. So I'll create a dictionary for data, and the dictionary is going to have the information that is here. So the amount, the currency, the description, and the source. So amounts, currency, description, and then the source. And the source needs to have quotes around it, and it needs to be the token, like I said before. So let's see. The just make this a little bit better looking. Okay, so the amount can be whatever I want. The currency, we'll just make it USD. And the description will be Stripe request example. So for the amount, let's say I want to charge $99. So it's the amount in cents. So if I do 99, that's 99 cents. 9.99, that's $9.99. So I need 9,999. This is $99.99. So actually, 9,900 will give me $99. So now I just need to pass that data to the request. So data equals data. And then I'll print the text of the request. So I have the Stripe dashboard here open. And by the way, once you create a Stripe account, if you want to try along with this example, the API key that you're using will populate automatically in the documentation. So you can just take that API key from there, but you can also go to the dashboard and get the API if you want, the API key. So I made a charge of $1.23 a little bit earlier. So now I'm expecting a $99 charge when I send this request. So let's try it out. So to run the Flask server, as long as the file is named app.py, it's going to run when I do Flask run. And let's see. It should be running a server on this URL, so we'll take it and run it. So now I see the form that I was talking about. So basically it takes in a credit card number and the additional information. So if you go to the test page for Stripe, you can see different credit card numbers that you can use. I'll just use 424242. So 4242. And then you can put in any month and year and any CVC and any zip code. So this is generated by the Flask app. So just as a refresher, return template is returning this page, which has the form in it. And then when I click this button, it's going to first submit the request to Stripe, get the token, and then submit the request to charge my endpoint here that I've made. And then once it gets here, all this code is going to run. So it's going to take in the API key, the token, and the data that I have here. It's going to pass it to Stripe, and then it's going to print the response in the console. So let's give that a shot. So I get an error, and we see name request is not defined. Okay, so very easy error to deal with. So import requests. And then let's do all that again. So I just stop the server with Control-C, do Flask run, and then go back to that URL and just try submitting the payment again. Okay, so submit payment. So we see done here. Now let's take a look at the console. This is the response from Stripe. So as we can see, some of the information is the same. So we see the amount, and then we see a bunch of extra things. So because this is a payment processor, they're giving you all the information possible for the payment. We did like the simplest possible payment, so a lot of this stuff is going to be empty. But as you can see, this is what Stripe returns to you. And if we go to the Stripe dashboard, we see the amount that I have here has gone up. So let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Or let's see, payments, I believe. Yeah, so we have this amount here, $99. And we just see the rest of the Stripe information. So we see what's being sent, a $99 request, along with the description called Stripe request example, like I have here. And it charges it for us. So if we change this number, let's say $199, and then another charge, and then we do this again. So let me restart the server, go back to the index, submit the payment, It says done. We go back to the payments and we see a payment for $199 with the description of another charge. So using post requests to send this is very straightforward. Of course, like I said, there's the Python SDK, so that might be better to use if you're actually working on a project that uses Stripe. But this shows you like the pieces of it in terms of the very basics. So the API or the SDK isn't hiding anything from you. You get to see everything that goes along in the request, which is actually not that much. So that's it for this video. I hope this video helps you understand how these requests work. And like I said, post requests, put requests, and patch requests are very similar in the sense that you're doing something to the server in some way. So if you have any questions about this video, you can leave a comment down below and I will get to it. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. So thank you for watching and I will talk to you next time.